I suggest we segue to free speech on social media. So this is something you track very closely, and there are a number of notes I have in front of me. Texas and Florida have passed laws banning various platforms from moderating content. Elon is against Twitter content moderation. Supposedly, Spotify has taken down some backlist from Joe Rogan. And there are a lot of open questions related to this, and I think a lot of perhaps undefined terms and other issues that we can explore. So where would you like to begin with free speech on social media?
Well, let me begin personally just with a disclosure, which is that having helped what was then Facebook make its oversight board, I still advise Meta on free speech issues, and I also sometimes advise other social media companies like TikTok. And so I'm not going to claim to be wholly objective about this. That said, I try very hard, and I think this is why I'm of use when I do advise, to not tell anybody what they want to hear. So what I'm going to say is just me talking, and it's what I actually believe. So I guess what I think is most fascinating is that we're at a really interesting inflection point about free speech and social media associated with Elon Musk's proposed Twitter takeover. And you and I have been both very fascinated to watch and see whether that would actually happen in the end. And maybe you want to share your grand theory about it, Tim. But in any case, what's fascinating about it is that in saying he's going to take over Twitter and take it private, Musk has not said, I'm doing this because I think this is a great business and I'm really good at business and I can make a company run well and I think there's a lot of money to be made in it. Nor has he said, I think it'd be really cool to do X, which is one of the things he does say usually. I mean, that's sort of the SpaceX theory. It would be really cool to do X and I can make money at it. Instead, he expressed, for I think the first time, at least in his public business career, a kind of free speech related values-based view. He basically said, I don't think it's good that Twitter limits people's free speech through content moderation, and I want to change that. So that's a pretty substantial reason to spend $40 billion, even if you had at the time, maybe 3 or 4 times that. I'm not sure he still does, but even if he had at the time 3 or 4 times that, that's a pretty fascinating motivation. It's a really different kind of motivation. And it's not only unusual for him, it's unusual for anybody. We might expect, Jeff Bezos to buy the Washington Post, but that did not cost any $40 billion for him to buy, or to sustain. That's a relatively small purchase from the standpoint of someone, with a ton of money. So the moment that we're in is a moment where the idea that content moderation is a problem for free speech is getting a lot of airtime. And where simultaneously on the other side, you've got the idea that the deplatforming of Donald Trump from effectively all of the major social media outlets at the time was something that remains supported by many, many liberals in the political spectrum, notwithstanding that it's hard to imagine a greater violation of the principle of free speech than that the guy who was president of the United States then and remains, the most popular politician on the Republican side can't speak through these platforms, especially given that the guy, Donald Trump, made his reputation to some significant degree using Twitter. So we've got sort of the two extreme positions arrayed here. And what we don't have is a lot of clarity about the terms on which this fight should be played out.
So
I can say more about that, by the way, if you want. I was just pausing so I don't go on for too long.
Yeah, please say more. And I would also just love to know if we're dealing with a wide spectrum of definitions for free speech, or if it's free speech in quotation marks with other motives at play. You don't have to speak to that right now, but I would like to explore that because...
Totally. That's exactly where I was going to go.
Great. Let's go there because I think like many people, are like, well, wait a second. Like what this person is calling free speech is not, I think, what one would find the perhaps legal or constitutional definition to be. And then what this person is calling free speech is really driven by this motivated reasoning around what they want or some financial outcome or who knows what. So I'd love you to expand on that.
Your insight, Tim, is actually, I think, the single most important starting point for figuring out what's going on in this debate right now. And it's that we can't define what free speech is unless we dig down a little bit underneath the slogan. So free speech has two different meanings, basically. One meaning is the ordinary meaning of the term, which means something like, I get to say what I want to whom I want when I want to say it. And that would include my saying it on social media. And if I'm deplatformed from social media, or if my post is taken away because it violates the terms of service or community standards of a particular social media platform, then under that ordinary meaning of free speech, my free speech has been limited. I can't talk in the place and way that I want to talk. Then there's what you might call the lawyer's definition of free speech, or the constitutional definition of free speech. And that's really narrow. What that says is that under the First Amendment to the US Constitution, the government can't stop me from speaking. But only the government. A private party can stop me from speaking. So the example I always use with my common law students, though they may be irritated at me for doing this, is I point out that if you teach constitutional law as your day job, like I do, your kids at a very early age tell you, when you tell them to be quiet, that they have free speech rights. So my son, I don't know how old he was when he said that, but very, very young, maybe 5 or something. And I explained to him then, and for a couple of years afterwards, that he actually didn't have free speech rights vis-a-vis me. He only had free speech rights relative to the government, but I could tell him to shut up, and I could give him consequences if he didn't, close his mouth or not say or do a particular thing. And he didn't like that very much, but I think for my students, it's a good way to remember the constitutional definition. It's the reason you can tell someone to shut up without violating the Constitution. And similarly, under that constitutional definition, so far at least, and I'm going to go there in a moment, but so far at least, if a social media platform, which is a private company, which has its own constitutional rights, tells one of its users, you can't say that, or we're kicking you off the platform, the social media platform, has a constitutional free speech right to say, we don't want to carry your speech. And you, the user, have zero constitutional rights vis-a-vis the social media platform. So notice right away that that's a completely different definition of free speech, and it's one that's just focused on the government. What's really fascinating, is that second constitutional norm is under some pressure, because there are now some Supreme Court justices, at least 2, probably 3, who have been telegraphing in short opinions, not in full Supreme Court opinions, but in short opinions, that they think that the idea of constitutional free speech should be reinterpreted so that the social media companies can't regulate all of the speech on their platforms and claim the protection of the First Amendment when they do so. And those justices, they're conservative justices, have a really interesting set of arguments that 4 or 5 years ago, liberals kind of liked, but then liberals gave up on them, but now conservatives like them. And those arguments basically say something like this: a ton of our conversation is happening on social media. Maybe we should analogize social media companies to a common carrier, like a telephone wire company, which can't pick and choose who's allowed to get a telephone and who isn't allowed to get a telephone based on what they're going to say over their telephone. Or maybe they should be thought of as public accommodations, sort of like a chain of hotels, which can't say, we're not letting you stay in our hotel because we don't like you. That would be discrimination, and it would be unlawful. And so those justices are saying we should reconceptualize the social media platforms as more like one of those two things, either like a common carrier or like a public accommodation. And we should allow the government to pass laws that say they can't discriminate on the basis of viewpoint. And the state of Texas, because they like to be out ahead, that was a joke, the state of Texas passed such a law. They have, in fact, passed such a law. They passed a law saying, maybe it wasn't a very funny joke, they passed a law saying that social media companies with more than a certain number of users, I think it was 50 million users or something like that, so the big social media companies, cannot take down any content based on the viewpoint expressed by the social media company. And of course, the social media platforms and others immediately went to court to get that law blocked. And The first court said, okay, we're going to block the law. Then the Court of Appeals said, we're reinstating the law. And then the Supreme Court, by a very close vote, by a 5-4 vote, said the law is not going to go into operation while the lower courts figure out if it's constitutional or not. So that legal court case is ongoing, and it's going to be really, really, really important because it goes to this core question of whether those two different definitions of free speech should remain poles apart, two different definitions, or whether they should come together and become a single definition of what counts as free speech.